Okay, we're live. So welcome everyone. This is the community meeting for Kyverno on December 16th. I'm Jim Bagladia, one of the maintainers of Kyverno. So I want to welcome folks joining in. And if the rest of the team wants to quickly introduce themselves.
Okay, hello everyone, this is Shooting. I'm also one of the maintainer of Kyverno project, and I'm sure you've seen me on the Slack channel. I've been actively interactive with folks, like the users from the community. So yeah.
Hi everyone, this is Pooja, and I am working for Kyverno project from past 4 or 5 months, I guess. And yes, I'm also the one of the maintainer for the Kyverno.
And other folks on the call, if you, and it's optional, right? If you want to introduce yourself, please do. It would be great to meet you. Otherwise, we can dive into the agenda as well.
All right. Turn on my webcam so that you can see what I look like. I'm Chip Zoller. So you probably know me by now from incessant badgering and other things trying to improve the project. I work at Dell Technologies, currently in the VxRail business unit, where I am somewhat of the technical lead on Kubernetes and cloud native apps, and am interested in trying to bring Kyverno to the rest of the world and make it the de facto way that policy is applied and managed in Kubernetes.
Yeah, and thank you for all the feedback and the great blog posts and interactions. It's yeah, great to have you as part of the community.
Thanks.
Anyone else want to do quick introductions or? All right, no worries. So then we'll just dive into the agenda, and feel free, as again, as we go through, if there's anything you need to say, so we can keep this interactive. So just jump in. So first thing, of course, we've been working towards the 1.3 release, and there's a few pending issues that Shooting, Pooja, myself have been working through. Most of the major fixes are in. So right now we're just looking at stability and tightening up a few loose ends. So maybe Shooting, if you want to give a quick update, you can, if you want, you can also share on GitHub on the release, and then we'll go through, see if there's anything else we need to pull in here.
Okay, let me share my screen. Just a sec. So we're wrapping up the changes for 1.3.0. We've fixed a lot of bugs in the past releases, and here are the list of the remaining issue. So currently, one major one is to reduce the throttling request on the report change request, because we noticed that we're sending the updates and delete for this RCR resource too fast. So it's got throttled when we generate the policy report. So I'm working on that. And another one is, I think it's a feature, kind of a feature request. Is this, we want to look for the data from the old object of the admission request instead of the latest or the current object, so that in some of the deletion option we can look up the data from the previous resource. And also I think Pooja is working on some of the finalizer for the generate controller. There we've
yes, I'm working on it.
Right.
I'm working on the 1374 issue. So the synchronize true. And yeah, it's I think it had to.
Okay, so the basic idea is to trigger the resync of the generate policy whenever there is a change on the target or generated resource. Like if we delete the generate resource, we want to recreate that immediately. If some of the source resource change in the generate policy, we would also want to sync that immediately to the target resource. So these are the basic issues that remain in the 130. I feel like we can finish, wrap up most of the changes in the next following days. So when the official 130 should be available soon.
Just shooting show and team, should we do another release candidate, and then I guess let folks test that out for a few days and then do the official one, or should we at this point is I think stable enough where we can put out an official one?
I would say for the generate and the look up the data for the old object, this is something we can do the test on our end. But for the throttling request, I think it depends on the scale of the cluster.
Right.
If you have a relatively large cluster, maybe the result is slightly different. So I would say maybe we can do another release to get the opinion from the folks.
Yeah, and if you check that thread that I commented on, Shooting, there's a new issue that I discovered after the patch that you put out. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to see it, but so regarding the generation with labels, it's now broken for generating into existing namespaces when it sees the label being assigned. So previously that was working. After the fix that you provided, it did fix the issue of multiple generate rules within the same policy label selectors, but it broke it for the other issue. So for that, I think there should be an RC9 that's cut just to ensure that there's no regressions of existing functionality.
Okay. Do you know the issue number? Is that recently created or?
It's not a. It was the discussion that we're having on Slack. Let me see if I can find it.
Okay, yeah, definitely. It seems like something we should add to the 130 list and track and put out a patch then in the next day or so.
Yeah, I guess it's related to 1374. I haven't commented on that, kind of because I was waiting for confirmation from somebody else that that this was a regression. I can add it to it if you like, either now or after it's confirmed, but just kind of waiting to hear back on that since we kept all this conversation in the thread, hear back there and figure out what to do about it.
Right. I think this is one I mentioned that Pooja is working on, that we want to sync the changes immediately. Is that what you?
Yeah, but this issue, it's not about the synchronization does work. It's just it waits for the 15-minute background scan period to roll around. What I'm talking about is the fix that you provided the other day. It broke previously functioning ability, and that's what I mean.
So this was the behavior when you add a label or remove a label from a namespace, you know, to trigger the generate on that.
Right.
Is that okay?
Yep. Yep.
All right. Yeah, we can do some testing on that and make sure that that's working, and then put out a patch. So maybe, yeah, we can perhaps after the meeting Shooting, let's split that into a separate issue. If it's not related to what Pooja is working on, we can track that separately then.
Yeah, and I'll create an issue for it. I would just, like I mentioned, it would be nice to have some confirmation so that I'm not creating an issue that is some mistake that I made. If it's confirmed, then track it. But if not, I don't see how it's something that I'm doing wrong. But if you can just give me that confirmation, I'll create the issue and we can track it from there.
All right. Sounds good. So then going back to the list, so we'll definitely put out an RC9, but and ideally if we can get most of these major changes done and include that in RC9, then after that, after there's some runtime on RC9, we can just put out 130 as the release itself, right? Okay, so we'll work towards that, and I think seems like we're a few days away from the release, so it's exciting. Would like to wrap this up, so because there's a lot of other things we want to get to on the roadmap. All right, so let's go back to the agenda and see. Yeah, so we had the roadmap items, but maybe before we go into that, there was a discussion item on the policy repo. I think, Chip, you had added that, and we've had some, discussions on Slack and various forums on what to do. So yeah, would love to hear your thoughts and get feedback from others too on what we can do to have, a good usable repository of samples, and also something that folks from the community can contribute to, and somehow balance some of the concerns we've been discussing. So Chip, maybe if you want to share your perspectives on this and ideas, and we'll talk more.
So Kyverno is an interesting beast because it has so much functionality that is great. It's a very flexible tool, and it has a lot of different functionality, broadly divided into 3 categories, obviously, like we know. But the problem here is that with that broad functionality comes lots of different possibilities of rules that users can create, which is also great. But that creates an organization issue, because when you're talking about organizing YAML manifests in a repo, they can only be in one folder or another. So do we put them all in folders that attempt to describe like high-level use cases, things like best practices or pod security standards, or what about if it's not that? What about if it's a variation on that? So then there's a problem there. Do we put them all into manifest where we just separate them into validate, mutate, and generate categories? Well, that's good for some things. It's not good for other things. And then regardless of how you organize them in a repo, users are still either at the mercy of trying to discern what the policy does based on its file name, which is not super helpful, or we have to statically maintain a README like we've been doing and copy and paste in the YAML and other information, which, that's useful. But I think in the long run, I think what would be ideal is to have policies in their own repo like they are now, but to have the user experience be through some sort of a web portal that's not GitHub, and in which users are able to go to some sort of web page and search and browse the types of policy that they want based on a variety of criteria. So maybe users are looking for things that are within the pod security standards. So we could use metadata in the form of annotations applied to policies and have that read in through some sort of framework that would build this index, through a system of tags. So users could go to a web page and say, all right, show me all the policies that are considered a best practice, and that are a mutate, and that use that match on pods. I'm just creating an example. It could be anything. It could be, unions of many other things, or maybe I don't care about any of that. I just, I'm trying to figure out how I can do things around control services in my environment. So show me all policies that have to deal with services. Don't care about any other criteria, but show me all of them that have to do with services. So, this is something that we should be trying to solve in a way that's as user-friendly as possible. And the idea that I was thinking of that I think would make this ideal is, what if we used a Hugo theme, which the Kyverno website does today in the form of the Doxy theme, which is nice for documentation, but there's not really a theme that exists that does what we that would satisfy these design goals. So I was sort of toying with the idea of, well, let's create a Hugo theme, since we're already invested in Hugo, that will read in the repository, read in the manifests, and parse the metadata in the form of either annotations, or maybe it's some other type of annotating syntax that we use. It's really irrelevant how that's marked up, but pull that in and then build a static page from it that allows users to then do searching and filtering, and that directs them to the file at the end of the day. So the repo structure can be anything. It can be a complete flat repo structure, doesn't really matter. But the user experience can be through the web portal, which points them to the policies that they want. So that was the idea. I think that would satisfy, not only provide a really nice user experience, but help users to find policies that they're really interested in looking for, regardless of how they might build those criteria.
Yeah, so I think overall that does seem like the best way to provide that, user experience for users, who are searching, browsing, trying to learn, and trying to find the right policy sample to get started with. So definitely think, some way of generating HTML markdown from the policy YAMLs itself, either through the theme, or even if you have some intermediary tool which does that, I think that would make a lot of sense and add a lot of value. One other thing, and by the way, so we've already started some of the migration into, so one thing which we've been wanting to do is to move the policies, the sample policies, into their own repo. And one other initiative we're working on is to align them with the pod security standards. So there's this ongoing set of discussions in various Kubernetes SIGs on the future of pod security policies, right? And driving that is, or most likely pod security policies as we know them today, uh, almost definitely they're going to be deprecated. The only question is when, and the other question is what happens after. So those are still ongoing discussions, and there could be a potential, a new construct in Kubernetes, which provides some baseline security, which would be goodness for everyone. But in the meanwhile, there is this set of pod security standards, and something that Chip mostly did with a little bit of help from me is we split out the current sample policies into into a separate repo, and they're organized by pod security by the different standard levels. So this is actually a link to the pod security standards, which talks about the three. Privilege means everything's allowed, and then there's a default and restricted, right? So going back to how we've organized this over here, the idea was to then allow someone. So there's one class of user which Chip described, right? But the other users we need to think about is someone who just wants to use our policy group within their cluster by just through like some GitOps tool, like whether it's Flux or Argo CD or something else, and they want to point to our upstream Git repo. So the idea here was that you would have a customized file, and this customization would give you, so let's say if you want restricted, you would just point to, you would run customize or kubectl apply -k and point to this GitHub repo, and it would pull down all of the policies in the restricted group, right? So it builds on top of default, then adds in the extra policies required for the additional security checks, and you get the restricted level of privilege. So I think the goal would be, so I see that at least maybe 3 personas who would care about these sample policies, and we should probably, document this somewhere, maybe in a GitHub issue or in a separate doc, and think about what's the best way to address this. One persona is, of course, the user we talked about, who going through the web page, browsing, searching, learning, and looking for the right sample policy. The other persona is, some cluster admin who wants to, use a set of policies, whether they're best practice, recommended policies, or they're just curated policies like the pod security group. And then the third persona I can think of is just Kyverno developers, because we also want to leverage um, these policies as part of our end-to-end testing, right? So we want to come up with a way to write unit tests for every policy, including the pass-fail cases, perhaps include them in the same repo as the policy, and then have a tool. And one option is to, extend the Kyverno CLI to address this, to be able to just run like something like Kyverno test, and it would scan the folders, pick up the unit tests, and run them, and show like which ones pass or fail in a simple manner. So we could, make that part of our CI/CD process as well, is to use those policies. So anyways, I guess long-winded way of saying there is perhaps more personas that we need to, categorize and just come up with the best set. And Chip, I think, like you said, the structure of the repo can be decoupled from how we organize the web interface on top, and then we just have to think about what's the best way of adding in the unit tests.
Yeah, I glad you brought up the point about the PSS and users wanting to just point upstream. I think that is, so I don't think it has to be an all or nothing thing. I don't think all of the
Right.
policies have to be organized into only one structure. I think this would be a case of like pod security standards is a standard. When you say best practice, like that could mean anything. When you say other, that could mean anything. And that's really subjective as to who, best practices are not everyone's best practice. But pod security standards are an upstream standard that have been established. So that makes the most sense to sort of isolate into its own folder structure. Using customize, it's already there, makes perfect sense. As far as unit tests, that could be a case where, again, the repo structure itself doesn't matter, but what I've done with tests is maybe, and this is just an example, but where we could have a unit test folder or file that's prefixed or suffixed with something, and the CLI tool could parse that and know that, all right, if we've got a policy with this name, then we're looking for a unit test that has this added to the front or back of it, something to that nature. So it would give you both of those abilities. The PSS could be in their own folder with customize, and users could just point to that. And everything else could be in arbitrary folders, and they could also have their own unit test. Everything could have a unit test. So I don't think it's an or situation. I think there are a lot of things that we could do. But the other thing that is good to point out about these policies is that, with a tool like Kyverno, really the best way to learn about it is to look at those policies. So not only are they a functional artifact, but they're a teaching aid. And sometimes you just want to go and see, all right, how is this policy written? Like, I may not want to download it and apply it to my cluster, but I want to see how it's written because I need to do something similar. And I don't want to pull down a whole repo just to do that. I want to go and find what I'm looking for and use that as a way to teach me how to use the tool. So there are multiple angles that would have to be satisfied, but that user experience in a web page can solve some of those.
Right.
And then organization into repo structures with unit tests can solve others.
Yeah, absolutely. And just making it simple for all three. And then I think I agree with you. I don't think it's orthogonal. I think all three concerns can be met. We just need to make sure we're coming up with a structure that works. And then the other thing, like I mentioned earlier, just making it easy as folks are building samples. If we have some common structure and a way to submit them along with tests, that would be fantastic, right? So then we keep growing the common sort of shared library of best practices, like recently with that I guess the CVE that was published, it was fairly simple to fix with Kyverno. So those type of things we can immediately add to the repo and publish, right? So others can leverage from what we're doing. Okay, so we'll continue, some discussions. I think there's a GitHub issue on this, so we'll consolidate and start addressing these concerns, right? So, I was gonna come up with some structure for the unit tests as a next step. I think Chip, you were, investigating the Hugo theme, and based on what you find there, I mean, I think it would be fairly straightforward to write. If we want to, we could write another command line tool which produces some intermediary markdown or HTML, but I'm sure you can, do that from the theme as well. So whatever works best there, we can figure out.
Yeah, I had one question on the Hugo theme angle. Is that I think that's something that we can have produced. I don't have the wherewithal to be able to write that from scratch in the way that I think it needs to be done. So is that something that we would be able to commission to have done? If I guess I don't know I don't know exactly how CNCF governance works, if there's any funds that are available to us. I'm happy to donate something to somebody to get a theme written. I think it is going to take a custom theme in order to get this done, because there's just not anything that's out there that goes and scours YAML files and allows you to pull in tags based on structures. And I just don't have the time to. I can't spend 6 months writing something and then debugging it and then committing to extending it. So is that something that we would be amenable to the idea of commissioning, or is that out of the question?
Yeah, I think we can check, but I don't think there is any program where you can just allocate funds like that through the CNCF for sandbox projects. There are, of course, with working groups and things like that, there are, internship programs and community outreach programs. So it's mostly, though, the best way would be to kind of see if on the folks who work on the CNCF website and other, other potentially overlapping areas have some interest in developing something like that. And if there's interest in reuse across projects, then that would make the most sense. I think we can also, and certainly if it comes to things like that, we don't want to be necessarily blocked looking for the perfect solution. So if there's something intermediary, like if that we can do to keep moving towards the end goal, and then we'll, look for better options if it requires that type of sponsorship.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll try and find out from others. But the other thing maybe we can do. Not sure if anyone knows of any Kubernetes group. I know there's a group for the website, right? So that may be the best place to ask if there's folks interested, or if anyone in the community has developed teams and maintains things like that. So I don't know who maintains Doxy. Is it still Google, or is that now CNCF, or?
Yeah, it's Google, but it's an unofficial project.
Okay.
And I did take a look at that, and I mean, you could do anything. I mean, you could modify any of these themes. You could modify Doxy to do it, but at that point, you're talking about so much work to basically get that functionality that you might as well just build a new theme around it. It doesn't have to be super complex, but it's going to be, you're going to be custom coding no matter what you do, because this is just a very specialized use case. But I can take that and see what our options were, and if I don't mind sponsoring that to get that done, if that's something that the community thinks would be valuable and it satisfies the use cases. Like I'm willing to make that contribution myself.
Okay, yeah, let's find out and discuss options and see what we can come up with, and we'll make progress there. All right, so I think anyone else have any other thoughts, feedback on that point before we move on? Okay, so then let's quickly go over the roadmap items and think about, it's 1.4, which should be our, so typically what we've done with releases is after we put out, a minor release, so, we follow the major minor patch. So we'll put out 1.3, like we talked about, as the next, minor release, which will have the new features. So the next feature release will be 1.4, and we will, of course, as fixes are required for 1.3, we will continue with like 1.3.1, 1.3.2, etc. But meanwhile, we can also start looking at, features. And, one of the items we have been, slowly moving towards, and the generate controller was a big, change that we made to help move towards this. And I think we have most of the modules in place, but more design and research needs to be done to move to a model where we can bring up multiple instances of Kyverno. But more importantly, we want to move into the default configuration of the webhook. Today, we configure it as fail open, which means if the API server does not hear back from Kyverno for any reason, it still continues. At some point, we want to move to fail closed, which would mean, and of course, we'll make this configurable, but the idea would be to require that Kyverno acknowledge a admission request before the API server can proceed with that, right? So to do that, of course, we need to make sure for larger deployments, for clusters, we can scale and handle admission requests. So today we have a very aggressive goal. We limit Kyverno to 3 seconds. The API server by default allows up to 30 seconds, and we've purposely kept this extremely low because we want to make sure our code is optimized and Kyverno can answer very quickly. And we haven't seen major issues with that, although we're seeing some of this API throttling type of problems where Kyverno is making calls to the API server for background tasks. We haven't seen any problems necessarily with meeting the 3-second goal. So I think we can, as we move to the HA scheme, we will relax that a little bit, maybe go up to like 10 seconds or so. But the idea would be that one of the instances of Kyverno is always there to answer an admission request, and anything that we're doing is completely stateless and can be scaled across multiple instances. So we're looking for, if anybody on the call knows of good, we've seen what some of the other. So it's interesting. A lot of controllers are not HA in Kubernetes, right? And you don't have to be HA because if you're running as a deployment, well, you can, and with rolling updates and things like that, the downtime is minimal anyways, right? So, but of course, for something critical, you want to move towards a full HA mode. So if anyone knows of, again, other controllers, or especially like, CRD or custom resource controllers that have implemented this, would love to hear about more best practices and schemes. What we're thinking of at the high level is we'll do a leader election for any background tasks, and we need to figure out the exact rates, etc. So the work will be distributed across these multiple instances, and the idea would be that we will set up the pod affinities. So if there's multiple instances, they will be delegated to different nodes or servers, and that way we spread some of the compute load as well. It's a fairly major item. I don't know, Shooting, Pooja, and Yuvraj and others on the call if you want to add some more thoughts towards that. But that's one thing which has been on our list, which I feel would be important to start tackling and making progress on for 1.4.
Yeah, I would say HA is definitely like one major feature that we want to achieve in 1.4. And I don't think we want to increase the webhook time, which is set to 3 seconds now. I think for the HA, the most important that it reduce or eliminate the pressure for the background controller, right? Whereas periodically scan the existing cluster and generate the policy report. I think that's one of the major points that we want to add for the HA. And for the webhook, I don't think currently we have an issue for that. So
Right. Yeah, the webhook will be mostly request response, so that will scale nicely, right, with multiple servers or multiple instances behind the service. Yeah, with the background, any of the background tasks, as well as anything that we're doing right now, which is stateful, like if we have, an internal channel, etc., we'll have to revisit and make sure that that state can be recovered if there's a switch, like across instances, etc.
right. Yeah, and we have a cache for the policy in the
Right. So those sort of things we'll have to make sure that we can properly distribute and manage across instances. Okay. So that probably will be our main priority and for 1.4, and it will, there'll be changes into at least the packaging and how modules work today. So we'll have to kind of tread carefully and make sure we're designing that correctly as we go forward. Some of the other features, major items I could think of, and feel free again if there's more we should add to this list and start. Of course, we have all of these in GitHub, but I just wanted to extract like what the major feature items are. And the one which seems fairly important for certain use cases is being able to look up data from the API server and use that as part of the policy context. So that's been one we've discussed, and I think we have a preliminary design for. I can't recall if it's something that I tried prototyping at one point, but it's something we can get done. It's and at least allow those type of lookups. The concern there is again API hitting the API server with these, and if it's a policy that's very frequently executed, it would be best to look up things from a cache. So, but there's problems with caching individual resources and things like that, right? So things we have to work through and come up with a design. Other major features we've talked about is, we've kind of floated this idea and gotten, positive as well as maybe not so positive feedback on, adding JavaScript as a potential way of, writing more complex rules. And, the thing that's attractive about it is it at least gives us a way to do more complex checks, which cannot be today covered, through some of the other declarative syntax. There's also, some, and we had looked at this at one point, but in the JMES path libraries, some way to provide, or to be able to extend or write our own custom functions, right? So here, this is not something a user would provide, but things like, if we want to look up something in a JMES path and be able to, transform or change for one of our policies. So those were two. They're more for writing. I guess all of the other three features are more for writing policies and adding more flexibility and extensibility there.
Yeah, one other thing, I don't know if it would be appropriate for the 1.4 roadmap, but at some point in the future, really extending the schema validation that Kyverno does to cover more of its own custom resources, but also when a policy, based on whatever the kind is, that it validates those resources as well. So this is one thing that I see over and over and over, not only with myself, but with other users, is you have a policy that's supposed to do some action against, let's just say it's one kind, let's say it's a pod or whatever. And then they write the definition in the spec, but the schema might be valid for Kyverno, but the schema is not valid. The portion of it's not valid for whatever the object that they're matching on. And that means that you've got this haphazard validation, like it's validating its own thing, but it's not validating the thing against which it's supposed to function. And that's, I see as a big gap and a difficult thing for that hurts user adoption is, you know, when they write a policy and they submit it to the controller and the controller says, yeah, we're good, we'll work on that. And then and logging doesn't help this either. When you go and try and find out, all right, why didn't this apply to the resource? Well, log showed nothing. So did like something broken? Did I do something wrong? Have no way of knowing. So extending the schema checks to cover the resource kinds that are declared in the policy as an almost under the cover extensibility would be a hugely helpful feature to have in a major milestone.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? Because it's more, I think what you're referring to is like validating resource paths, things like that. So if we have an overlay or a pattern, you know, if you just write some arbitrary YAML, it may not match the resource at all. And Kyverno thinks everything's good, but the problem's the policy doesn't match the resource structure.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's some challenges with that because you have, maybe you're writing against a custom resource which isn't a documented schema. So it's not, you know, using an Open API 3 schema. But what can happen as a fail-safe in those instances is, you know, you've got the policy that defines some, you know, schema as an overlay or something, and then it's supposed to operate against that object. Well, Kyverno could at least check the resulting object that was mutated or validated. And if it sees that there's a mismatch, regardless of whether the schema was validated or not, it clearly didn't work. So, you know, there can be some fail safes to work around issues where you've got some sort of community object out there that publishes its own CRD, but it's not a documented CRD schema, so you can't, you know, it's not self-documenting. But you can check the result on what was supposed to incoming and what was outgoing to see if there's a match or mismatch.
Yeah, the only challenge with that would be dealing with things which are optional, right? Because if we don't know, if we can't look up the schema, there could be optional resources, and also we have some other related bugs filed where today, like if you supply JMES path, you know, structure, Kyverno doesn't create optional resources. The expectation is that they're already pre-created, like so defaults and optional things in the structure. But interestingly, for the overlay pattern, Kyverno does create those. So we do have the logic to deal with that if the CRD is defined, right? So if we can look up the syntax, then we know what resources to create or what structure to create before we apply the validation or whatever, you know, rule we're processing. Yeah, so some, you know, definitely agree that because it's happened, you know, to me also quite often is like I'll take a rule written for a pod and try to apply it in a deployment and then spend, you know, some time trying to figure out why it's not working, right? And the CLI helps if you turn on additional debugging. It will show you that why it's skipping a particular resource, but you have to run the CLI with like V5 or something, and it'll show you that.
Yeah, and that's something for, especially for you know, Kubernetes internal resources. They're all documented. Like that, it can get the schemas for all of those. For other things that are out there that, you know, there are thousands of them. Okay, you know, there's no guarantees, but Kyverno can check as soon as the policy or the rule is submitted to it before it gets stored. It can validate that at that time until you know, return to the user or the process, hey, you know, the overlay pattern or whatever you're calling for this resource or maybe it's multiple resources and you have to do sort of a least common denominator, but it's not valid for those resources. So reject it before you even store it. So just some more logic wrapped around that to, ultimately the idea is to give Kyverno more guardrails so that it doesn't allow people to fling themselves off a cliff and expect one thing and then not get that thing.
Right. Makes sense. Okay. Yeah, so we can see. I don't recall I don't think there's an issue logged on this for validating policies. I think there's some logged on the JMES path that I described. But yeah, we can add this and start tracking, because I think it'll be a good one to, like you said, just for folks writing policies, getting started. It certainly would be super helpful. All right, sounds good. So those were some of the major items. Any other ideas, thoughts, feedback, things we should be tracking as features for the next release? And I'm not, I don't know if we'll be able to get all of these into the release, but these are just candidates. And I think if everyone agrees, at least our thought process was the HA is probably the first one and the most important one, and then we'll see what else we can get into the release, and we'll of course plan a 1.5 and so on after that.
In my opinion, I would, if push comes to shove, I would probably move the JavaScript extensibility to the next release, because that's a really advanced, powerful thing that's being proposed. And there's a lot of work that would take to get that right, because you brought up the point a while ago. Well, what if you're calling outside of the cluster and a result is delayed in coming? Well, what do? Do you fail? Do you pass? Do you go into a race condition loop? So I think the highest priorities for 1.4 would be HA, because not even Gatekeeper has that today. That's a big deal, and that's something that if this is going to get adopted in production, large scale and high impact clusters, you have to have high availability, and also API server lookups. Like that's something else that opens up a whole nother possibility of best practices, things that are not just academic but really functional. Things like saying my services need to have a unique combination of selectors. Like that's a really important one, and making sure the ingress paths are unique across the board. Like those are really, that opens up a lot of really necessary functionality. So I think those are the two big key ones. And if that takes up all the cycles, I say I would bump JavaScript extensions to the next release, to make sure that has the time to get well baked. Just my thoughts.
Right, that may be something we introduce even as a experimental feature for a while, right? Just because we need to think through and get some feedback even on the security aspects of it, right? Because so that at least the high level thinking there was that we will not allow any arbitrary JavaScript, but it's going to be limited to a certain set of capabilities. But yeah, we haven't gone into much detail there, and we need to make sure, again, we would limit it for time, we would limit it for what can you do in that JavaScript. And the idea really is to help with writing more complex checks, right? So, and not so much to, I mean, you don't want to allow running any arbitrary JavaScript code for sure. So it will have to be regulated and somehow limited. So yeah, I agree. I think if we do manage to get something in there, it will be more as an experimental feature, which can be enabled, disabled, and disabled by default. But then we will continue to improve and expand on that for as we get feedback and see the use cases. But yeah,
just as long as API server lookups don't require JavaScript, because nobody wants to do that.
Right. Yeah. So, but there is an interesting correlation there, because once you get the data back from the API server, it's most likely, it will almost always be JSON data. So the question is, how do you process that? How do you, I mean, of course, if you're looking up a single field, or if you then apply a JMES path to it, it allows you to do certain things, but then it kind of bumps up the priority for having more customizable or advanced JMES path functions, right?
Yeah, that's
So,
true. That's true.
yeah, and that's where, like, if you have the power of JavaScript, there's a lot you can do with that API data. But if you're limited to just checking values, it's not, I mean, you can still do certain things like you mentioned, the examples you mentioned, those would be handled. But other checks, like if you want to do counts, etc., either you need custom functions or the ability to write your own.
Yep. Yeah, that's very true.
All right, but totally agree. I think that and it's probably not. I guess there is some correlation. I'd put things down in that order in the list as well, right? So I think I had the same sense of priorities. So good to get the confirmation there. All right. Any other thoughts, feedback on the roadmap itself?
There's a lot of good stuff there.
Yeah, no, it's
A lot of work
exciting.
to do.
But I think each one of these features is, it's actually an interesting and fun feature to develop. So looking forward to that. Okay, so I think that's all we had on the agenda. Any other topics anyone else would like to share, discuss, or even questions or anything else to ask? All right, well, if not, have a great holiday, everyone. I think our next meeting will be in January, but of course we'll be on Slack and reachable through the various forums. So, just let's, in the next few days, we want to get 130 out. So we'll be focused on that. But after that, we'll start some longer term discussions on these other topics as well. Okay, thanks everyone. Take
See you
care.
next year.
Bye-bye.
Bye.